The dust of the prairie holds the ghosts of broken men. Men who bet it all and lost, men whose dreams dried up with the riverbeds, and men who found their last measure of comfort in the cold, hard steel of a pistol. Jebediah Cain was one of those men. He'd lost his land, he'd buried his wife, and he'd drank his soul down to the last bitter dreg. Standing on the edge of Coyote Gulch, with the world a meaningless blur below, he was ready to join the ghosts. But fate in its cruel and beautiful wisdom wasn't done with him yet. His final act was interrupted by a cry for help and a plea from a widow that would drag him back from the abyss and into a fight for a life he never knew he wanted. The Wyoming wind had a serrated edge in the autumn of 1888. It scraped across the parched plains and whistled a mournful tune through the skeletal remains of Jebediah Cain's ambition. His farm, once a testament to his sweat, and Martha's faith, was now a monument to failure. The creek had run dry 2 summers back, turning his fertile soil to a cracked, mocking mosaic. The cattle, what few remained, were little more than hide-stretched skeletons. He'd buried Martha a year ago, come winter, the fever stealing the light from her eyes, with a swiftness that felt like a personal affront from God himself. She was the anchor of his world, the soft hand that had always steered him back from the jagged rocks of his own temper. Without her, he was adrift in a sea of silent, dust-choked grief. The final nail in his coffin had been hammered in by a man named Alistair Finch, a smooth-talking speculator from Cheyenne with a silver tongue and a portfolio of worthless paper. Finch had sold half the ranches in the county on a new irrigation scheme, a grand canal that would divert water from the North Platte. Jebediah, desperate, had sunk his last savings, every penny he and Martha had painstakingly set aside, into the venture. The canal was a phantom. Alistair Finch was a ghost vanished with the lifeblood of a dozen families. Now Jebediah sat on the tailgate of his rickety wagon, the town of Rose Creek, a hazy smudge in the distance. In his hand, a bottle of the cheapest whiskey money could buy. In his lap, cold and heavy, lay his old Colt Peacemaker. It was the only reliable thing he had left. He'd cleaned it this morning, not for a fight, but for a final quiet purpose. He took a long, burning swallow from the bottle. The whiskey didn't warm him anymore. It just hollowed him out, echoing in the vast, empty spaces where his life used to be. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who had worked the land until it broke him. They'd built a home, held a wife, and dug her grave. What more was there for them to do? His mind flickered back to Martha. Her laughter, the smell of baking bread that clung to her clothes, the way she'd look at him over the top of her spectacles when he was being stubborn. Jebediah Cain. She'd say, her voice a mix of exasperation and deep affection. You could wrestle a bear and win, but you can't win a fight against your own pride. She was right. Pride was all he had left, and it was a bitter, useless companion. It was pride that had kept him from asking for help, pride that had made him believe Finch's lies, and pride that now told him this was the only honorable way out. A clean exit. No burden to anyone. He raised the pistol, its weight a solemn promise. The metal was cold against his temple, a stark contrast to the throbbing heat behind his eyes. He thumbed back the hammer. The click was the loudest sound in the world, a definitive metallic punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence. He closed his eyes, picturing Martha's face, hoping she'd be the first thing he saw on the other side. The wind howled a fitting requiem. Crack! The sound wasn't the roar of his Colt. It was sharper, closer. It was the splintering of wood, followed by a woman's sharp cry of alarm. and the frightened whinny of a horse. Jebediah's eyes snapped open. His own problems, so immense a second ago, were momentarily shoved aside by the ingrained instinct of a man of the frontier. Trouble was trouble, and you faced it. He lowered the pistol, the hammer still cocked, and squinted toward the dirt road that led to town. About 100 yards away, a small farm wagon was canted at a dangerous angle. One of its rear wheels shattered. A lone woman was struggling to control a spooked mare, her hands tight on the reins. 2 small figures' children were huddled behind her skirt. He cursed under his breath. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want complications. He just wanted the quiet end he'd promised himself. He tucked the Colt back into his waistband, the intention still heavy in his gut, and took another swig of whiskey. Maybe if he ignored them, they'd move on. But the woman wasn't giving up. She finally calmed the horse, tying it to a scrubby sagebrush, before turning her attention to the disaster of the wheel. She knelt, her dress immediately covered in the fine red dust, and assessed the damage. Her shoulders slumped. Jebediah could feel her despair even from this distance. He told himself to turn away, to walk up into the rocky crags of Coyote Gulch, and finish what he started. It was none of his business. He was done with the world and its endless stream of broken things. But then the smaller of the 2 children, a little girl with hair the color of spun corn silk, began to cry. It wasn't a loud, demanding wail, but a soft, hopeless sound that the wind seemed to snatch up and deliver directly to Jebediah's hollow heart. It was a sound he hadn't heard since Martha. He growled in frustration, a sound of self-loathing. He was a ghost already. What help could he be? He was a broken man trying to fix a broken wheel. The irony was almost laughable. Almost. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resolve, he corked the whiskey bottle and set it down. He pushed himself off the tailgate, his joints creaking in protest. Every step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, each one, a step away from the peace he craved, and back into the world of pain he was trying to flee. As he approached the woman, looked up, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and caution, she quickly pushed the children further behind her. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps not yet 30, with a face that was handsome, despite the lines of worry etched around her eyes and mouth. Her dress was plain, but clean, her hands capable. "Ma'am," Jebediah grumbled, his voice rusty from disuse and whiskey. "Looks like you're in a spot of bother." Her gaze flickered from his face, unshaven and grim, down to the butt of the pistol sticking out of his waistband, and then back up. She stood her ground. "We're fine. Just a broken wheel. We'll manage." Her voice was steady, but it carried a tremor she couldn't quite conceal. The little boy, who looked to be about 8, stepped out from behind her. He held a rock in one hand, trying his best to look menacing. "You leave my ma alone," he said, his voice high but determined. Jebediah stopped a respectful distance away, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Not here to cause trouble, son. I was just nearby. A wheel like that axle's probably splintered too. You won't be managing that on your own, ma'am. Not before nightfall." He could see the truth of his words dawn on her face. Her defiance began to crumble, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Her shoulders sagged again. "The name's Jebediah Kane," he said, foregoing the offer of a handshake. His hands weren't fit for shaking anymore. "Elara Hayes," she replied, her voice softer now. "This is Samuel, and this is Lily." She gestured to the children. Lily peeked out from the folds of her mother's skirt, her big blue eyes staring at him with unnerving intensity. They were Martha's eyes. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he had to look away, focusing on the broken wheel. "Your husband's in town?" he asked, his tone flat. A shadow passed over Ilara's face. "My husband, Thomas, he passed. A logging accident up on the mountain this past spring." A widow. Of course. The world seemed to have a special kind of cruelty for women left alone. Jebediah knelt and examined the damage. The wheel was a lost cause, spokes shattered and the rim warped. The axle pin had sheared clean off, and the axle itself was cracked. It wasn't a simple repair. It would take tools, time, and skill. Skills he possessed, but had no desire to use. "It's bad," he said, stating the obvious. "You'd need a new wheel, maybe a whole new axle assembly. Can't fix this on the road." Ilara's face fell completely. "We were just trying to get our supplies back to the farm. It's only another 2 miles. She bit her lip, fighting back tears. She was trying so hard to be strong for her children, and Jebediah's presence, his grim assessment, was the final straw. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jebediah stood up, feeling an unwelcome and unfamiliar ache in his chest. It was pity. He hated it. Pity was for other people, for a world he was no longer a part of. He should turn around, walk away, and find his peace in the gulch. Let the townsfolk help her. Someone would be along eventually. He looked from her stricken face to the 2 children. Samuel was still trying to look brave, but his bottom lip was trembling. Lily had buried her face in her mother's dress, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. They were alone. Their father was dead. Their mother was at her wits' end. They were stranded on a dusty road with night coming on. He felt the weight of the colt at his back, a cold, dead thing. It promised an end to his pain, a final silence. Then he looked at the children again, at their raw, living, and desperate need. An end for him was just the beginning of a new terror for them. Ilara must have seen the war playing out on his face. She saw the profound emptiness in his eyes, the kind of hollowness that only comes when a person has given up completely. She saw him glance back toward the desolate rocks of the gulch, and in a moment of stunning intuition, she understood. She wasn't just looking at a gruff stranger. She was looking at a man standing on the edge of his own grave. Her expression shifted from despair to a fierce, desperate plea. It wasn't for herself. It was for them. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out, not tall to him, but toward her children, as if presenting them. Her voice was low, but it cut through the wind and the whiskey haze in his head with the clarity of a church bell. "Mr. Kane," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I don't know what burdens you carry, and I can see they are heavy, but I can't fix that wheel. I can't protect my children from the coyotes or the cold when the sun goes down. I am one woman alone." She paused, taking a breath. She looked at Samuel, then at Lily, her gaze full of a mother's fierce, unwavering love. She looked back at Jebediah, and what she said next wasn't a request. It was a conscription. "You can do what you want with your life tomorrow," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You can walk into that gulch and never come out. That is your right. But not today. Today. These 2 little ones need you now." The words struck him with more force than a physical blow. These 2 little ones need you now. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about his grief, his failure, his desire for oblivion. It was about a broken wheel, a coming night, and 2 terrified children who had already... already lost their father. He looked at his own useless, trembling hands. He had thought their purpose was done. But here was a purpose laid bare and undeniable right in front of him. It wasn't the grand purpose of building a legacy or a prosperous farm. It was small, immediate, and utterly essential. Fix a wheel. Get a family home. For the first time in a year, a feeling other than grief or self-pity flickered within him. It wasn't hope. It was something far simpler and far more powerful. It was responsibility. He let out a long, slow breath, the air rattling in his chest. He looked at Alara Hayes, at her tear-streaked, dust-caked, beautiful and defiant face. He looked at her children. Slowly, deliberately, he reached behind him, pulled the Colt peacemaker from his waistband, and uncocked the hammer with a soft, final click. He didn't toss it aside. He placed it carefully in his own wagon, underneath an old burlap sack, burying it. He turned back to the widow and her children. His face still a grim mask, but his eyes, for the first time in a very long time, were clear. "All right, Mom," Jebediah Kane said, his voice the low rumble of a machine stirring back to life. "Let's get you home." The act of helping was a foreign country. Jebediah had forgotten how to navigate. For the past year, his world had shrunk to the size of a whiskey bottle and the four walls of his own misery. Now, under the watchful eyes of Alara Hayes and her children, every movement felt clumsy, every word an effort. "My wagon's just over that rise," he grunted, pointing with his chin. "It ain't much, but it rolls. We can unload your supplies into mine, and I can take you and the children to your farm. We'll have to leave this wagon here for now. We can come back for it tomorrow with tools." Alara nodded, a wave of relief washing over her features, so potent it seemed to physically steady her. "Thank you, Mr. Kane. Thank you." "No need for thanks," he muttered, already turning away. "Just makes sense." The work was a strange and painful balm. As they transferred the sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and precious bags of seed from her broken-down wagon to his, Jebediah felt the protest of muscles long softened by idleness and drink. The sweat that beaded on his brow felt cleansing. It was a penance. Each sack he lifted was a weight not just of supplies, but of purpose. Samuel the boy tried to help. He grabbed a small crate of tinned peaches, his face a mask of concentration, as he staggered with it towards Jebediah's wagon. "I can take that, son." Jebediah said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Samuel flinched but held on tight. "I can do it. Pa taught me to carry my own weight." The mention of his father hung in the air between them. Jebediah saw the boy's fierce pride, a mirror of his own stubbornness, and something inside him softened. He remembered being that age, desperate to earn his own father's approval, to be seen as a man. "All right then," Jebediah said, his tone a little gentler. "But bend your knees when you lift. Don't break your back before you've even got a hair on your chin." A flicker of a smile touched the boy's lips. It was a small victory, a tiny bridge built between two wary worlds. Lily, meanwhile, watched Jebediah with an unnerving, silent curiosity. While he worked, she approached his wagon and peered inside, her blue eyes landing on the burlap sack where he'd hidden the Colt. She didn't touch it, but her gaze lingered as if she could sense the cold, heavy secret beneath the cloth. The Hayes farm was 2 miles down a road that was little more than a pair of ruts in the earth. It was nestled in a small valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a low-lying mesa. As they crested the final hill, Jebediah felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was a proper farm, small but well kept. The fences were mended, the cabin was solid, its windows clean. A vegetable garden, though nearing the end of its season, showed signs of diligent care. Thomas Hayes had been a good man, a hard worker. This place was his legacy. It was everything Jebediah's farm was not. The comparison was a fresh wound. He felt like a fraud, a derelict bringing his stench of failure to this small sanctuary of hope. "You can pull up by the barn." "Mr. Kane," Elara directed, her voice regaining some of its strength now that she was on home soil. As he reined in his weary horse, a large, rangy dog with ears that flopped at mismatched angles came bounding out, barking ferociously. The children immediately ran to it. "Down, Buster," Samuel commanded, throwing his arms around the dog's neck. Jebediah remained on the wagon seat, his hands on the reins, feeling suddenly out of place. His job was done. He had delivered them. Now he could retreat, find his bottle, and reconsider his appointment at Coyote Gulch. Elara seemed to sense his imminent departure. "It's nearly dark," she said, quickly climbing down from the wagon. "The least I can offer you is a hot meal and a place to sleep for the night. The barn is warm, and the hay is clean." He opened his mouth to refuse. The thought of sitting at her table, of accepting her charity, was galling to his pride. He was the one who was supposed to provide, to protect. But then he looked at her face, earnest and open, and he heard the unspoken part of her offer. It wasn't just about payment. It was about not being alone, even for one night, for her sake as much as his. And there was the matter of the broken wagon. He'd made a promise. "A meal would be welcome, ma'am," he heard himself say. "And the barn will do fine." "Thank you." The inside of the cabin was small, but it was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stone hearth. It was the warmth of a home. A simple quilt was draped over a rocking chair. Children's drawings were tacked to a wall, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was a suffocating reminder of everything he had lost. He sat at the plain wooden table, feeling oversized and unclean, his hands looking like dirty lumps of rock against the scrubbed pine. Elara moved about the kitchen with an economy of motion, preparing a simple supper of beans, bacon, and fresh bread. Samuel sat opposite Jebediah, studying him with a solemn intensity, while Lily played on a rug by the fire with a collection of smooth stones. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the sizzle of the bacon and the crackle of the fire. "This is a fine piece of land," Jebediah said, trying to fill the quiet. "The well, it hasn't run dry." Elara shot him a quick, almost startled look over her shoulder. "No. Thomas always said this land had good bones. The well is deep and has never failed us, thank the Lord. It's why he refused to sell." "Sell?" She hesitated, turning back to her cooking. "Silas Blackwood. He owns the big Rafter Bee Ranch north of here. Most of the valley, in fact. He wants all of it. Says the small farms are inefficient. He approached Thomas a few times, offered him a price. But your husband refused. Thomas was born on this land." She said, her voice full of a quiet fire. "He said some things aren't for sale." "Mr. Blackwood." He did not like being told no. She fell silent, and the way she gripped the handle of the frying pan told Jebediah there was more to the story. Before he could ask, the food was ready. They ate in near silence. For Jebediah, each bite was an act of profound shame and gratitude. It had been months since he'd eaten a meal he hadn't paid for, with the last of his coins at a noisy, dirty saloon. The simple food tasted like a feast. When they were done, he pushed his chair back. "Thank you for the supper, Mrs. Hayes. It was, much appreciated. I'll see to the animals and then turn in." "Elara," she corrected him softly. "And you're welcome, Jebediah." As he stepped out into the cool, dark air, the sounds of the night seemed amplified. He tended to his own horse and Elara's mare, his movements slow and deliberate. The routine was familiar, a ghost of a life he once knew. As he forked fresh hay into the stalls, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't happiness, not even contentment. It was just quiet. The screaming in his own head had subsided to a dull hum. He found a clean, empty stall in the corner of the barn and made himself a bed in the sweet-smelling hay. He lay back his hands behind his head and stared up into the darkness. He had survived the day. He had delayed his own end. But for what? To repair a wheel for a woman who would be a constant, painful reminder of the family he'd lost. He was just beginning to drift into a shallow, restless sleep when a faint sound brought him instantly awake. It was the soft creak of the barn door. He sat up, his senses on high alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the spot on his waistband where his colt should have been. A small silhouette was framed in the moonlight from the open doorway. It was Samuel. The boy was holding something, a hammer in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. He approached Jebediah's stall cautiously. "Mr. Kane," he whispered. "Are you awake?" "I am now," Jebediah replied, his voice low. "What is it, son?" "You should be in bed." Samuel came closer, his bare feet silent on the dirt floor. I brought you these." He held out the hammer and the box. "It's Pa's." The hammer was his favorite. "And these are his nails." He kept them sorted. He said a man is only as good as the state of his tools. Jebediah stared at the offering. The hammer was worn, its wooden handle smooth and dark with the sweat of an honest man's labor. The box was meticulously organized with different sizes of nails in their own compartments. It was an heirloom, a sacred trust. "Your pa was a smart man," Jebediah said, his voice thick. "But I can't take his tools, Samuel. It's not for taking," the boy insisted, his voice earnest. "It's for using. For the wheel. Ma said you were going to fix it tomorrow. You'll need good tools." Jebediah looked from the boy's determined face to the hammer in his hand. He understood. This wasn't just about fixing a wheel. This was a test, a handing over of a mantle the boy was too young to carry. Samuel wasn't just giving him tools, he was giving him his father's trust. Slowly, Jebediah reached out and took the hammer. Its weight was familiar, balanced. It felt right in his hand, more right than the colt had. He ran a thumb over the smooth handle. "Thank you, Samuel," he said quietly. "I'll take good care of it, and I'll get that wheel fixed right." The boy nodded, a look of immense relief on his face. He turned to go, but hesitated at the edge of the stall. "Mr. Kane." "Yes. That man Ma talked about?" "Mr. Blackwood. He came by last week. He told Ma that this farm was no place for a widow to be alone. Said accidents happen." The boy's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. I think Pa's accident wasn't an accident." The boy's words hung in the silent barn, cold and sharp as one of the nails in the box. A logging accident. It was common enough. But coming after a threat from a man like Silas Blackwood Jebediah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had been dragged back from the edge of his own grave, only to find himself standing on the edge of someone else's. He had wanted to escape the world's complications, and instead, he had stumbled into the heart of a quiet, deadly war. The weight of the hammer in his hand suddenly felt immense. It was the weight of a nail, the weight of a broken wheel, the weight of a promise to a boy who believed his father was murdered. And Jebediah Kane, who had been ready to give up on everything, knew with a terrible certainty that his work here had only just begun. Dawn broke thin and grey over the mesa. Jebediah was awake long before the first rooster crowed, the ghost of Samuel's accusation clinging to him like the morning mist. "I think Pa's accident wasn't an accident." The words had replayed in his mind all night, a somber drumbeat against the silence of the barn. He rose, the aches in his body, a dull reminder of his own neglect. He looked at Thomas Hayes's hammer, lying where he'd set it beside his bed of hay. It seemed to judge him. This was a tool for building, for creating, for holding a life together. For the past year, his only tool had been one of deconstruction. He found Elara already in the yard, scattering feed for a small flock of chickens. She moved with a weary grace, a woman carrying the world on her shoulders. She managed a small, tired smile when she saw him. "Morning, Jebediah. There's coffee on the stove if you want it." "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice still a low rasp. He decided not to mention his conversation with Samuel. It was a boy's fear, perhaps. Voicing it to his mother would only add to her burdens. For now it was a seed of suspicion he would keep to himself. After a cup of scalding black coffee that jolted his senses, he set to work. He hitched his own horse to his wagon. "I'll ride into town, see a man named Jedediah Miller at the livery. Tell him I need to borrow a wagon jack and some tools, and I'll see what he has for a replacement wheel." He deliberately used his full name, a name he hadn't offered freely in years. It was a small test. Elara's eyes widened slightly. "Sheriff Miller. You know him?" "Our paths have crossed," Jebediah said vaguely. It was an understatement. Years ago, back when he wore a tin star himself in a dusty, forgotten corner of Nebraska. Jebediah Kane and Jed Miller had tracked the Clayton gang for 3 weeks across the Badlands. They'd been friends of a sort, bound by shared danger and a mutual respect. He hoped Miller remembered him favorably. The ride to Rose Creek was different this time. He wasn't a man fleeing his life, but a man on an errand. The distinction was subtle, but profound. The town itself seemed different too. Instead of a blur of faceless buildings, he saw the details. The blacksmith's forge, the general store, the imposing 2-story facade of the Rafter B Saloon, which he knew instinctively belonged to Silas Blackwood. He found Jed Miller shoeing a horse in the livery stable. The sheriff was a barrel-chested man, with a kind face and a sweeping mustache that had gone mostly grey. He squinted as Jebediah dismounted. "Help you, mister?" "Looking for Sheriff Miller." Jebediah said, his hat pulled low. "You found him, though the sheriffing part mostly involves settling disputes over fence lines these days." He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed a flicker of recognition in their depths. He looked at Jebediah's gaunt face, the haunted eyes, and the way he held himself. "Kane," he said, his voice dropping. "Jebediah Kane. By God, I thought you were dead. Heard you'd settled down. Bought a farm over by the Laramie Range. The farm's gone, Jed?" So is Martha. Jebediah said the words, tasting like ash. It's a long story. Miller's professional suspicion softened into genuine sympathy. He clapped a heavy hand on Jebediah's shoulder. I'm sorry to hear that, Jeb. Truly sorry. What in blazes are you doing way out here? Jebediah quickly explained about Elara Hayes and the broken wheel, leaving out any mention of Silas Blackwood or his own suicidal intentions. He was just a man helping a widow in need. That was the story he was trying to believe himself. Miller listened, his expression growing grim. Elara Hayes, a good woman from a good family. Thomas's death was a hard blow to this community. Left her in a tough spot. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. A spot Silas Blackwood is keen to take advantage of. So I've heard, Jebediah said, his gaze steady. Blackwood's got this town in his pocket, Miller said, lowering his voice. The saloon, the general store. He holds the debt on half the folks here. They're scared of him. He's been trying to squeeze Elara off that land since the day Thomas was buried. There's talk the accident. Wasn't an accident, Jebediah said, testing the waters. Miller's face darkened. There's talk, he admitted, but no proof. A tree fell the wrong way. It happens. The two men working with Thomas that day were rafter B men. They swore it was a tragic mishap. Then they quit the county a week later. I have my suspicions, Jeb, but suspicions don't hold up in court. A man like Blackwood, you need more than that to pin him down. The sheriff led him to the back of the livery. Take what you need. A good spare wheel, a heavy jack. Bring it back when you're done. And Jeb, Miller looked him square in the eye. Watch your back. Blackwood doesn't like complications, and a man like you showing up to help the widow Hayes, he'll see you as a complication. Jebediah loaded the heavy wheel and tools into his wagon, the sheriff's warning echoing in his ears. As he was about to leave, two men on horseback rode past the livery. They were rough-looking men with rafter B brands on their saddles and pistols worn low on their hips. They slowed as they passed, their eyes lingering on Jebediah. One of them, a man with a jagged scar that cut through his left eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Their stare was cold, appraising. A message. Jebediah met their gaze without flinching until they rode on. He wasn't Jebediah Kane, the broken farmer, anymore. He was someone else. Someone they might have reason to fear if they only knew. But he had buried that man long ago. The repair took the better part of the afternoon. It was hard, grueling work. He jacked up the wagon, wrestled the broken axle free, and set about fitting the new one. Samuel watched him, a silent apprentice. He handed Jebediah tools before he even asked for them. His young face a study in concentration. Lily sat on the cabin steps, arranging her stones into patterns, while Elara brought him a tin cup of water every hour. They worked together as if they were a family, and the thought was so painful, so terrifyingly sweet, that Jebediah had to force it from his mind. He focused on the wood, the steel, the satisfying thump of the hammer. He was a mechanic, nothing more. A man repaying a debt. As the sun began to dip towards the mesa, he hammered the final pin into place. He lowered the jack, and the wagon settled onto its new wheel, solid and true. That should hold, he announced, wiping a forearm across his sweat-soaked brow. A genuine, radiant smile broke across Elara's face, transforming her. Jebediah, I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, he mumbled, already gathering the tools. He felt a desperate need to leave, to get away before the fragile walls he'd built around his heart crumbled completely. He would return the tools to Miller, collect what little he owned from his own wagon, and disappear. He'd done what she asked. The little ones were safe. He was free to go. Just then, 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the farm. The setting sun silhouetted them, making them look like dark omens. They rode down into the valley with a slow, deliberate arrogance. Jebediah recognized the man with the scar from town. The man in the center, broad and imposing even in the saddle, could only be one person: Silas Blackwood. He reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the repaired wagon, the children Elara, and finally settling on Jebediah with a cold, dismissive curiosity. Blackwood was a man in his 50s, with a face like a slab of granite, and eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried an assumption of authority. "I see you've found yourself some help." Elara stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Samuel and Lily scurried behind her. "Mr. Blackwood, this is a private residence." Blackwood ignored her, his eyes still fixed on Jebediah. "You're new here?" "A drifter." Jebediah slowly straightened up from the wagon wheel, his body tensing. He did not speak. "I offered you a fair price for this dusty patch of nothing." Elara Blackwood continued, his tone turning condescending. "A generous price, considering your circumstances. I am a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. This is no place for a woman to raise children alone." "This is my home," Elara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "It's not for sale." Blackwood chuckled a humorless sound. "Everything is for sale, my dear. It's just a matter of finding the right price." His gaze drifted to Jebediah again. "Perhaps your new friend here is advising you poorly. A hired hand should know his place." The man with the scar, whose name was Boone, leaned forward in his saddle. He'd been studying Jebediah intently, a puzzled look on his face. Suddenly his eyes widened in recognition. "Boss Boone," said, his voice a low hiss. "Boss, wait a minute. I know this man." Blackwood turned to him, annoyed. "What are you talking about years back?" Down near the Cimarron Strip, Boone said, a new nervous energy in his voice. He was staring at Jebediah as if he were seeing a ghost. "He rode with a star back then. They called him the Ghost. Because when he came for you, you were already dead. That's Jeb Kane. That's the man who hunted down the Reno brothers." The name fell into the quiet yard like a stone into a still pond. The Ghost. A name Jebediah hadn't heard in a decade. A name he had tried to outrun, to bury under soil and sweat and love for a good woman. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Silas Blackwood's face. He looked at Jebediah with newfound interest, a predator sizing up unexpected prey. "Well, well," Blackwood drawled, "a retired lawman. This does complicate things." Or perhaps, he added, his smile widening, "it simplifies them. A man with your reputation. Kane. Turning up on a poor widow's farm just as she's having a string of bad luck. A town full of my friends might find that suspicious." Jebediah felt Elara's shocked gaze on him. He felt Samuel and Lily peering out from behind their mother, their faces filled with confusion and fear. He had tried to be anonymous, to be a nobody. But Boone's words had resurrected a past he could no longer deny. The Ghost was back. And Silas Blackwood, far from being intimidated, looked delighted. He had just found the perfect weapon to use against Alara Hayes. He had found a way to turn her savior into her downfall. The dust settled long after Blackwood and his men disappeared over the ridge, but a different kind of dust. The dust of the past now choked the air in the small farmyard. Blackwood's parting words lingered like a curse, twisting what should have been a moment of triumph, the repaired wagon, into one of profound dread. Jebediah could feel Ilara's stare on him, heavy and questioning. He didn't dare meet her eyes. He was no longer Jebediah Kane, the quiet, broken stranger. He was the ghost, a man who hunted other men, a name synonymous with violence and death. He slowly began gathering the tools he'd borrowed from Miller, his movements stiff. The silence stretched thin and fragile until Ilara finally broke it. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She had pulled Samuel and Lily close, her arms wrapped around them in a protective embrace. Jebediah stopped, his back still to her. "Is what true?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "What that man said, about who you are, who you were." He turned then slowly. Her face was pale, a storm of emotions swirling in her eyes. Fear, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite decipher, a sliver of betrayal. He had come to her as a man at the end of his rope, not as a legend with blood on his hands. "The name is true," he admitted, his voice low and devoid of pride. "The stories, they get bigger with every telling. But I wore a star. I did things I'm not proud of, to keep peace in places that didn't want it." "The Reno brothers," she said, the name sounding foreign on her lips. "They were killers." "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had fixed her wagon, the same hands that had once pulled a trigger to end a life. For a decade, he had tried to see them only as the hands that had held Martha's, that had worked the soil. Now the stain felt fresh again. "That was a different life, Ilara. A different man. I buried him when I met my wife. I wanted peace. I wanted to build something, not tear things down." His gaze drifted toward the horizon, toward the place he had almost thrown his life away. "When Martha died, and the farm, there was nothing left to build. The man you met on the road yesterday, that was what was left. Nothing." He expected her to tell him to go. He deserved it. He was a plague, bringing his past down upon her and her children. Blackwood was right. His presence here was a complication she didn't need. He picked up the last of the tools. "I'll return these to Sheriff Miller," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "Then I'll get my things and be on my way. Blackwood won't have cause to trouble you further." He started to walk towards his wagon, a familiar hollowness opening up inside him. He had been given a brief, painful glimpse of a life with purpose, and now it was over. "No." The word was quiet but firm. He stopped and turned. Ilara had taken a step forward, her chin lifted. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was being eclipsed by a stubborn resolve. "No," she repeated, stronger this time. "You will not leave." "Ilara, you heard him. My being here puts you in more danger. He'll use me against you. He'll paint me as some kind of outlaw trying to take your farm." "Let him," she shot back, her voice ringing with a surprising fire. "He has been trying to run me off this land with whispers and threats since the day Thomas died. Now he has a face and a name to put to his accusations. What's changed? Nothing except now. I'm not alone." She walked right up to him, forcing him to look at her. "I don't know the ghost. I only know the man who listened when my daughter cried, the man who saw a family in trouble and stopped to help when he was at the end of his own road, the man who fixed my wagon and treated my son with respect. That is the man I see. Is that man still here?" Her question was a challenge, a plea and a declaration of faith all at once. It cut through his armor of grief and self-pity more effectively than any bullet. She was not rejecting his past. She was asking him to be more than it. Something shifted inside Jebediah. The heavy weight of responsibility he'd felt the day before returned, but this time it wasn't a burden. It was an anchor. "Yes, Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "He's still here." "Good," she said with a decisive nod. "Then you'll stay. Not in the barn. There's a small room off the kitchen. It was Thomas's study. You'll stay there. You'll work for your keep. You are my hired hand, Jebediah Kane. And we will face whatever comes together." The next morning, Jebediah rode into Rose Creek to return the tools. The town was a different place. The few townsfolk on the street who had previously ignored him now either stared with open hostility or quickly averted their eyes. Blackwood's poison had been spread quickly and effectively. He was the villain in their story now. As he was securing the tools at the livery, Sheriff Miller came out to meet him, his face grave. "Word travels fast, Jeb," Miller said in a low voice. Blackwood was in the saloon half the night buying drinks and spinning yarns. According to him, the infamous gunfighter Jeb Kane has come to prey on a grieving widow looking to scare her off and steal her land. "That's his play," Jebediah said grimly. "It's a smart one," Miller admitted. "He's turning the law against you. If there's any trouble out at the Hayes place now, you'll be the first one they blame. He's got you trapped. My hands are tight until he makes an open move." The sheriff looked him up and down. "I know the man I rode with, but the ghost? That man drew trouble like a magnet. Are you sure you're ready for what you're inviting?" "I'm not inviting it," Jebediah said. "I'm just not running from it anymore." That night, the first move was made. A section of the northern fence line was cut, and a dozen of Ilara's sheep were scattered. It was a petty act, but it was a clear message. "We can touch you whenever we want." He and Ilara spent the next morning rounding up the spooked animals. The work was frustrating, but they did it side by side, a silent, shared understanding passing between them. When they were done, Ilara looked at the cut wire, her expression hard. "He wants me to be scared. He wants me to run." "Are you scared?" Jebediah asked. "Terrified," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "But this is my home. Thomas died for this land. I will not be the one to surrender it." That evening, as Ilara and the children slept, Jebediah Kane walked to his wagon under the cold light of the moon. He reached under the old burlap sack, his fingers brushing against the cold, familiar steel of the Colt Peacemaker. He pulled it out. It felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with the lives it had touched, and the life he had tried to build without it. He took it back to the barn along with his oil and rags. He sat in the hay-scented darkness and meticulously cleaned the weapon. He checked the action, the smooth, deadly click of the hammer, a sound from a past life. This was not the act of a man preparing for suicide. This was the act of a man preparing for war. He was no longer running from the ghost of his past. He was embracing it, sharpening its claws, because he finally understood. He hadn't been saved from the edge of the abyss just to find peace. He'd been saved to become the very thing a monster like Silas Blackwood should fear. He had been given a reason to live, and now he would fight for it. The final confrontation came 3 days later. Jebediah had been expecting it. He'd spent the time fortifying the farm in small, subtle ways, planning sightlines, points of cover. He sent word to Miller via a neighbor's boy. A simple message, "Trouble's coming." Blackwood didn't send his men. He came himself with Boone and 4 others just as the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley. They rode not with arrogance, but with grim purpose. This was not another threat. This was the final eviction. Elara took the children to the root cellar. Her last instruction to Samuel was to stay put no matter what he heard. "Jebediah will protect us," she said, her faith absolute. Jebediah met them in the open yard, standing alone, Thomas Hayes's hammer hanging from a loop on his belt. The Colt was tucked into his waistband, hidden by his coat. "Cain," Blackwood boomed, reining in his horse. "Last chance. Get on your horse and ride. I have no quarrel with you. My business is with the deed to this land." "This land isn't yours," Jebediah said, his voice calm and even. "I have a bill of sale right here," Blackwood sneered, pulling a document from his coat. "Signed by Thomas Hayes himself a month before he died. Seems he had a change of heart. His widow is squatting on my property. I'm here to claim it." It was a blatant forgery, a final desperate gambit. "You're a liar," Jebediah said. "And you're a dead man," Blackwood snarled. He gave a nod to his men. "Get him." But Jebediah was already moving. He wasn't the hesitant farmer anymore. He was the ghost. He dove behind the sturdy stone well in the center of the yard as the first shots rang out, splintering the air where he'd been standing. He drew the Colt, its action, smooth and familiar. He didn't fire wildly. He fired with purpose. The first shot took one of Blackwood's men in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The second kicked up dust in front of Boone's horse, spooking the animal and making Boone fight for control. From the window of the barn, a second gun roared. Sheriff Miller had arrived not in his official capacity, but as a man helping a friend. His rifle shot took another of Blackwood's men out of the saddle. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Blackwood, seeing his advantage crumble, panicked. He drew on Jebediah, his face a mask of rage. But Jebediah was faster. His shot was not to kill. It struck Blackwood's gun hand, sending the pistol flying into the dirt. Blackwood screamed, clutching his shattered hand. The remaining men, seeing their leader defeated and the sheriff involved, threw down their guns. It was over. Boone, the man with the scar, sat on his nervous horse, his hands raised. His eyes met Jebediah's. "He made us do it," Boone said, his voice shaking. "The accident. He had us loosen the ropes on the logs. It was supposed to just scare him, but it went wrong. We never meant for Hayes to die." The confession, raw and terrified, hung in the twilight air. It was the truth Elara and Samuel deserved. In the end, Silas Blackwood's greed was his undoing. With his forged deed and Boone's confession, his reign over Rose Creek was over. Weeks later, the autumn air had a crisp promise of winter. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like an ending to Jebediah. He stood on the porch of the Hayes farm, watching Samuel teach Lily how to properly stack firewood. The farm felt like home. The work felt honest. Elara came out and stood beside him, a cup of coffee in each hand. She offered one to him. "Sheriff Miller sent word," she said. "Blackwood was sentenced. He won't be troubling anyone for a very long time." "Good," Jebediah said, taking the cup. Their fingers brushed a small, simple touch that sent a jolt of warmth through him that no whiskey ever could. "The farm is small," she said, not looking at him. "But the work is hard for one person. even for two. It will be a long winter. We'll manage, he said. It was the same thing she had said to him on the road that first day, but now the words held a different meaning. They weren't a hopeful prayer. They were a statement of fact. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was Jebediah Cain, a hired hand, a protector, a man who had been ready to give up on life until a widow and her 2 children gave him a reason to live it. He looked at Elara, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and at the 2 children who had come to see him as a fixture in their lives, and he knew he had finally built something again. He was home. Jebediah Cain stood on the brink, ready to let go of a world that had taken everything from him. But in his darkest hour, a stranger's plea became his salvation. His story reminds us that purpose can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the strength to save ourselves comes from our willingness to save someone else. It teaches us that even when our own world has crumbled, we can still be the foundation for another's. If this story of redemption and resilience moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.